Thanks for coming along today. On behalf of the history team, I pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting today. I acknowledge that we are working and creating on country on the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past and present. So as part of the Heritage Festival, the city's history team has coordinated a series of 3 talks with a focus on the history of Darlinghurst. And these talks tie in with the recently published book about the history of that suburb, which is called My Darlinghurst. This book was edited by Anna Clark, Tamsin Peach and Gabrielle Chemis and published by UNSW Press. If you're interested, the library actually has copies and you can get them on interlibrary loan, or you can purchase them through UNSW Press as well, or any quality bookshop. Our final talk today is presented by my colleague, Nicole Cama. Nicole's one of the historians in the history team, which is a history team of 2, me and Nicole. And our other speaker is Janet Villata, who's a city archivist. So their presentation today is going to be a collaborative one, which will explore the people and places of Darlinghurst. And we'll look at Nicole's award-winning digital history project, which focuses on Liverpool Street. And this maps people and places. And Janet is going to share some of the vast array of historical data that is contained in the city archives, but her focus will be on the very wonderful assessment books. So thank you very much to both of them, and thanks everyone for coming along.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I hope some of you have been following the last 2 talks that were done on the history of Darlinghurst. I've certainly found it quite fascinating to learn firstly about the sounds of Darlinghurst, and then mainly in Layla's talk about the smells of Darlinghurst and some of the unique challenges that people have faced living in Darlinghurst in the past. So this session is a little bit of a change of pace to the previous 2, because it's partly a how-to guide. So that you can explore the history of Darlinghurst yourselves. And it's going to feature not 1, but 2 demonstrations of resources that are available to you. So hopefully our technology will work fine and you'll be able to see that. As Layla mentioned, we're going to primarily focus on the City of Sydney assessment books, which is a key group of series that is in the City Archives collection and available online. So I'm going to show you how to use them to learn about connecting people and places. And I'm going to use Darlinghurst in my examples, but really what I'm discussing is applicable to all of the key City of Sydney assessment books. So if you have people in other parts of the city, you can explore them as well. Nicole's going to show you how she's been connecting and analysing the data from the assessment books and other sources from the City Archives to learn more about the people and places of Liverpool Street in Darlinghurst. So the City Council was formed in 1842, and it was then called the Municipal Council of Sydney. The city local government area was divided into wards, and assessors were appointed to each of those wards. Officers would go out every 3 to 5 years between 1845 and 1948 to assess every property subject to rates within the ward. And the purpose of the collection was so that they could calculate the value of the property and determine what rates to charge. Now, we often have people coming to us in the archives asking to see rate books, which we do hold, but rate books contain limited information compared to these assessment books. Before I move on from this slide, I'll just point out the letter that's on the slide. So this is a letter sent from Council to Alderman Acton Sillytoe, who I think has the best name of an alderman of any that we have. But this letter is telling him to preside with the alderman from the Brisbane ward at the election of assessors. So letters sent are another series that are held in the City Archives that can complement our understanding of key council records, and our volunteers are working through making those available. So assessment books give a great range of information. They tell you the address, but they don't generally include the suburb, the owner or the landlord's name, the person rated, and until 1879, that was the tenant. After 1879, that could be the owner or the tenant that was rated. There's a brief property description indicating what kind of property it is, building materials for the building and roof, number of stories and rooms of the house, annual value, and comments. I'll also note that we hold assessment, sorry. So most of the City of Sydney assessment books have been digitised and transcribed by the archives volunteers. And if you want an overview of the wards and the years for the city books we hold, there is this table that's available on our webpage, on the assessment books collection page, which is on our online catalogue, and that links to the particular volumes. So you can see each year you can have a look at what volumes are available for the wards, because not all of the books have survived. I'll also note that we hold assessment books for some absorbed councils. So that's councils that came to us in amalgamations, including Waterloo, Alexandria, Macdonaldtown, Glebe, Darlington, and Newtown. They're not included in the tool that I'm going to show you today. While some have been digitised, most have not been listed. And our volunteers have listed the Newtown assessment books, which cover 1862 to 1892 separately, but they're not digitised. There is a link to the Newtown transcriptions on our assessment books collection page, and I'll show you that when we come to the demonstration. So today's talk is looking mainly at the City of Sydney assessment books, and to find them we go to the homepage of the Archives catalogue and click on the assessment book tile. And then there's mainly two ways that you can proceed. You can browse and search via the wards, or you can use the search option. So I'm going to go to a demonstration now to show you each of those methods. Okay, so this is the Archives and History Resources Catalogue homepage. And you can find this at archives.cityofsydney.nsw.gov.au. And so on the homepage, you just need to scroll down to these Browse by Collection tiles and find our assessment books tile. And this tile really is the centre of the universe for all things assessment books. Okay, so there's a number of links and things here. There's some information about the two different methods that I'm going to walk through today in case you need to go back to those. I mentioned the Newtown assessment book transcripts. There's a link to those here. And down on the right-hand side, you'll see a whole lot of other links. So there's an assessment book dataset, which I'll talk about in a little while. That table of links to the assessment books by ward and year that I showed you on the slide before is right here. There's a guide, and there's also a link to the historic ward boundaries, which is the way to get into the ward boundary search and browse. And there's also a search. So we're going to work through each of those. So I'm just going to click on the historic ward boundaries. And this takes you to a tool that was developed by our spatial team at the city. It's a really useful little tool. And what it does is it breaks down the ward boundaries into timeframes, because the wards did actually change over time. So you can see it's got the different timeframes. So you just choose one of those timeframes that you're interested in, and it gives you a map. You can zoom into that map to look at what areas are covered under what ward boundary. And you can keep zooming into this and even get down into looking at streets within that area as well. So you can see with the Cook ward that Darlinghurst is in the Cook ward, but it also covers some other suburbs, including Woolloomooloo, Potts Point and Surrey Hills. So I'm looking in that 1842 to 57 area. If I click on the ward that I'm interested in, it will bring up all the assessment books that exist for that ward. And then I can click straight in to one of those. So what you're seeing here is on the left-hand side, we have the scan of the volume itself. And on the right-hand side, we have the transcription. And you can walk along the bottom here if you want to browse through the book. Now, remembering that this Cook ward covers a number of different suburbs, and often suburbs are not listed in the books. So what you need to look for is along the side here, it's actually got the names of the streets. So you've got to sort of find if you're browsing, you just find your way through to the street that you're interested in. And I'm just going to go to page 17 because I know what I want on this page. So this is partly the coverage of Darlinghurst here. And if I look at the street names here, it says South Head Road continued at the top, and on the bottom it says Taylor's Row. So Oxford Street was formerly known as South Head Road until 1875. And so it went all the way up what is now Oxford Street, joined up with what is now Old South Head Road, right through to Watson's Bay. So you can see on this page that the tenant or the landlord for all of the, or most of this page, bar one, is Robert Taylor. So Robert Taylor was an English convict. He was transported for larceny for 7 years, and he came out in 1821, and he became a successful businessman and property owner. In fact, he was a brickmaker. His house was opposite Darlinghurst Jail at Taylor Square, which I always thought was a bit of a strange choice for a convict to build their house opposite the jail. But his was the first house and residential building on that part of Oxford Street. So Taylor's Row here refers to all of the buildings that he built and then rented out. Now, if I go back a previous page, you can see down here on the transcript that there are more entries for Robert Taylor. And in fact, he's living in one of the properties. It's a dwelling, it's brick with a shingle roof. There's 1 story and 2 rooms, and it's worth £20. So the grounds are actually quite large, but the house itself is quite modest. Now, you might assume that Taylor Square got its name from Robert Taylor, but in fact it didn't. Taylor Square is named after Alderman Alan Arthur Taylor, who was the Lord Mayor from 1905 to 1906 and 1909 to 12. And he was responsible for the widening of Oxford Street and the creation of Taylor Square. So it was named in his honour in 1908. I don't know the answer to that. So this is one way that you can look through the books by just browsing, but probably an easier way than working the way through that is that you can come over here and actually download the transcript and then do a search within it. So all of the entries that we have in the archives catalogue, if you're at the item level, has this toolbar on the left. And if you hover over it, you'll see what each of those buttons does. So there's a download button here. So you can go and download and you get a couple of options. You can download the original, which would actually be downloading this original scan of the volume, the handwritten volume. But what you'd want to do if you are searching this way is to download the attachment, which is a transcript. So it's a typed transcript. And then once you've opened the transcript, it'll appear on your computer and you can just do a Control F search and find what you're looking for. So we could put in Taylor and go straight to the entries for Robert Taylor. So as you can imagine, checking these books over subsequent years can help you trace the history of a property quite easily. Assessment books will also help you if you're looking for a particular person, where they lived or owned property, or businesses within the Sydney local area. And again, you can trace them through successive books. And if you have no idea if your ancestor owned property or was living or renting in the area, or if you know they did, but you weren't sure exactly where, then another option is to come back to the assessment books collection page and use the search. So this time I'm going to search on a woman just to even things up a bit. And her name's Mary Noonan, so we'll just do a search for her. So it is actually quite interesting to see in these assessment books just how many women own property and how many women were tenants. So you can see from the search on Mary, I've come up with 2 assessment books. One is the Brisbane Ward in 1845 and one's the Cook Ward in 1858. Now there's 2 different ways you can get in from here. The one way, and I'll demonstrate both ways on these books. So one way is to just click on that image and you get this search results page here. If you actually click on the little image again, it will take you directly to the entry here where Mary is. So we can see here that she was living in Kent Street in 1845. She was renting from Samuel Jones. And you can see here Samuel spelled S-A-M-L. Important thing to remember, that they often did abbreviate first names. She's living in a house. It's brick, shingled. It's got 2 floors and 4 rooms, and it's worth £26. Now, if I go back to my search, this time I'm going to try a different option, which is you can click on the preview button. Again, you get this screen, you click on the image, and it will take you directly to the page. So here we discover in 1858 that Mary's now living at 152 Liverpool Street. She's renting from a John Carney. It's a shop and a house. It's brick, slated roof, 3 floors and 5 rooms. So it's getting a bit bigger. £91 value, and it has 2 attics. So there is actually a third way to search as well. And I'm just going to go back to our slides for this. In 2021, we put together a consolidated list of City of Sydney assessment books. So if you want to search comprehensively across all of the wards for names and addresses in a very immediate way, you could try that list. And that's available through the City of Sydney's open data portal. There is that link from the assessment books collection page too, though, that I pointed out before. So just to be aware, it is a very large document. There's over 500,000 rows, so it does take some time to download if you're going to do that. And within that data, we still don't have the suburb for a number of properties, but what we've done is we've added all of the suburbs that belong to a ward to the entry for that, for each entry. So at least you get a selection of suburbs when you're searching there. Now, there are a few tips that you need to remember if you are looking at these assessment books. So if you're searching by name, these were the names that the assessor wrote down, and it may have been different or incorrect spelling in the different books. So you might have to try a couple of spelling variations, particularly if you have people like Max and Mix, just to see. First names are often abbreviated as well. So you saw the Samuel. You could have John as J-N-O or Charles as C-H-A-S, those kinds of things. So we say if there is an unusual surname, better just to try the surname. If you are going to try first name and are not getting results, you could try the sort of standard abbreviations. The transcripts were created manually by our volunteers based on interpreting the handwriting in the original books. And that's not very easy. So it can result in some transcription errors as well. And so in some cases, they might have misinterpreted what was written or they might have mistyped it. So just to be aware of that. So if you can't find someone and you know they should be in a particular area, you could try just browsing in the right time frame. And the other thing I would suggest too is that you could use the SANS directories, which are the postal directories available on our website, if there's gaps in the records. So the occupant of the buildings were not always the people listed as the ratepayers as well. So that's an important thing to remember. So if it's a boarder or a lodger or a subtenant or a family member, they're not going to be listed if they're not the person being rated or the owner. So it's not like a census where you get everybody at the property. If people moved in and out of a property between assessments, they also may not be recorded. And some tips for searching by address. So suburbs weren't always listed in the data, as I've said a number of times. Houses were often not numbered until the mid-1870s, so it's best to start with a street name. And we suggest you don't add the street type, like, street or road, just try the street name. Renumbering did occur as well, just to make things complicated for everyone. And streets also did change name. So in 1875, over 60 streets changed name in the Sydney local area. And in 1905, another 100 or so changed name as well. The history of the Sydney Streets Guide is on the City of Sydney website, and that can help if you're looking for name changes. And there's a link in the catalogue under further resources if you're looking for that. And I've got it on the slide there too. So just to finish off, we'd love for people to use and experiment with the assessment book data, which is why we've released it as an open data set. One of our staff was visualising the data the other day and creating graphs about the types of building materials used in houses and how that changed over time. And I thought it was interesting enough to show you a couple of these. So this graph shows that use of stone for houses, which is the orange, was fairly consistent. It had a big surge in 1891 and then lost popularity. And blue, the blue is brick. So that, sort of rose and became a very dominant building material. And this one is for the roof type, taken from the assessment book data. So shingles was the predominant building material for roofs, and that's that kind of dark orange at the beginning there. And then prior to 1882, but then it quickly declined and became near non-existent by 1896. And then you see this surge of iron, which is the yellow, and also blue, which is slate, and that replaced shingles as the primary roofing materials. And from these kinds of graphs, you can start to question quite dramatic changes. So, for example, what happened in that sort of 1891 to 2 period that changed how buildings were constructed? So did the Depression of 1891 have that kind of effect, or were there other factors? So this kind of data visualization is really great for historians to start seeing, new cues that they can follow through. And you can imagine if we match the assessment book data with other data sets, like our SANS postal directory data, then the possibilities for this are endless. And so if anybody's interested in doing data visualization, we'd really love to hear from you. And that's probably a good segue to Nicole, who's going to show you what she has done with the data.
Yeah, might need adjusting. Well, thank you so much, Janet. And thanks, Olivia, for adjusting the mic. So the famous Australian poet Kenneth Slessor once described buildings that climbed like mad stone mountains into the clouds in the suburb of Darlinghurst. His words are an evocative commentary on urban development in Sydney during the 1920s. And it was this image of a metropolis climbing into the sky, which was on my mind when I was producing the Liverpool Street Darlinghurst website. But how do you connect Slessor's dazzling portrayal of Darlinghurst with the historical records of the street, its structure, and its inhabitants? I will get to this story of urban transformation in a moment, but for now I want to talk a little bit about the historical material which inspired this project. So why the City of Sydney's assessment books? Well, my colleague Janet has already spoken about what these records are, and as you can see from her talk, and understand why they are such a boon for the researcher. But from my own perspective, I think they're a great place to start for the researcher wanting to just find out more about the city and its inhabitants, alongside the survey plans. Now, although they form an excellent type of resource for this sort of project, it is easy to get bogged down in the detail that they contain. Details of ownership, construction, and value are great to know, but what do they mean within the broader context of the street, the suburb, and the city? Let me give you a bit of background about the project, Liverpool Street, Darlinghurst, which is at darlostories.au. So this project is a digital history project mapping the development of a Sydney street over a century. The project was supported by the Australian Centre for Public History at UTS and the Paul Ramsay Foundation. And its aim was to illustrate the data from the assessment books in an accessible and creative way. Between the years 1848 and 1948, I discovered at least 4,000 assessment book entries for Liverpool Street, Darlinghurst alone. This was before even thinking about the variety of other source materials available: newspaper articles, survey plans, photographs, building plans, and so on. So I thought it was best to restrict the scope of this project to one street in one suburb. Working in collaboration with Nick Clark, software engineer, and Wing Pang, designer and illustrator, the challenge was to visualize this extensive data set in a creative way. So I decided to begin with a single research question. How do you tell the story of an inner Sydney street? I wanted to produce a website which went beyond data visualizations of historical information. I believe the strength of the data is when it is combined with a variety of historical source materials, which demonstrate not only the value of our cultural collections and the depth of historical inquiry as well. It is one thing to illustrate the presence of several building types in a graph, for instance. It is another to critically examine that data and place it within a broader contextual narrative. Looking at each form of historical evidence in isolation can obscure that contextual story. For example, a close examination of survey plans shows me there was a wooden octagonal structure opposite a bowling alley in the block bound by Liverpool, Riley and Oxford Streets in 1856. Why octagonal? Why, as the survey shading indicates, was it constructed of wood? And what happened to it? As by the time another survey was completed in 1865, the bowling alley had vanished and the octagonal structure was being swallowed up by housing. This brings me to one of the stories I uncovered. A search through newspaper articles in the National Library's trove confirms the structure was a dance hall, the Pavilion de Bellevue, which formed part of Smith and Company's Places of Amusement, which was established in 1855. In addition to an American bowling alley, the site also included a miniature riding establishment, or as we would call it, carousel. To find out more, I searched letters in the city's archives and newspaper reports. It appears the establishment failed to gain popularity and closed within a couple of years. In a letter to the editor, one concerned mechanic lamented how homes had been, quote, ploughed up by these houses of bad fame, which attracted the most unruly and unmannerly of both sexes of various ages and was situated away from the vigilant eye of the police. So what does all this add to that survey plan? Sure, it tells us about how some people were spending their leisure time in the mid-19th century, but it also helps paint a picture about the social makeup and built environment of Darlinghurst at this time, one at times characterised by a tension between the city's respectable and well-to-do inhabitants and the perceived lower classes, and perhaps young people. There is one interesting clue which also points to the broader context of urban development in Darlinghurst. As the name suggests, the Pavilion de Bellevue had, according to one newspaper, one of the most beautiful views in Sydney. This detail is important for the researcher because it illustrates the sparsity of urban development in mid-19th century Darlinghurst. Darlinghurst was described as a pretty hamlet of windmills, cottages, and paddocks before it turned into a district of commercial enterprises and terraces built to accommodate an expanding population. This image of a pretty hamlet was also described in the accounts of Obed West, who grew up on the ground between Paddington, Darlinghurst and Rushcutters Bay during the 1810s. It's difficult to imagine these undulating lands with its tall blackbutt and red gum trees and the stream of clear fresh water which pooled and cascaded until it reached the mudflats and flowed into Rushcutters Bay. West described it as, and this is a quote, an area of out in the country homesteads or farms. But he also described the tall cabbage palm trees which led up to the family's cottage, the native roses and waratahs on the hills, and how aquatic birds gathered in the mudflats. The West family continued to live here until the end of the 19th century, which, according to city historian Leila Elmuz, defied the general pattern of absentee landlordism that characterised the rest of the suburb. Until about the late 1850s, Liverpool Street remained predominantly vacant lands, characterised by a handful of buildings, mostly single-storey, toward the Hyde Park end of the street. In 1851, one of the earliest residents of the street, the town clerk, John Ray, constructed his 3-storey brick mansion, Hilton, which today houses the Robin Gibson Gallery on Liverpool Street. In total, the 1851 assessment book recorded 3 dwellings on the eastern side of Liverpool Street, including Ray's residence. The other 2 were made of stone with shingled roofs, including Reverend Mackinson's single-storey cottage on the corner of Liverpool and Darley Streets. This was described in newspapers as a capital dwelling house, situated in an elevated and airy position with a view over the harbour and shipping most delightful. It had 5 rooms as well as a servant's room and a veranda at the front and the rear. One of my favourite finds in this project was a series of very early stereographs depicting Liverpool Street, Darlinghurst at exactly this time, right on the precipice of change. Taken in about 1865, they show many of the structures recorded in the early assessment books and plans, some which did not survive the turn of the century. I believe these photographs were actually taken near Hilton Villa. And as you can see in this photograph, you can see Mackinson's capital dwelling house is on the corner. Today, it's the site of Nova, which was constructed in 1880. The neighbouring 2-storey villa, known as The Grange, still stands at 300 Liverpool Street. So you can just sort of see the roof and sort of the balcony popping out there. And right in the background, you can see the first version of the Royal Sovereign Hotel, known today as Darlow Bar, on the corner of Darlinghurst Road, established in at least 1857. This is a better view of the original hotel. And this is the building we see today, which was constructed in the late 1920s. It is no surprise that the photographer chose the more elevated sections of Liverpool Street to photograph. As you can see, these positions offered sweeping views of the harbour, as well as the city's centre and eastern parts, well before higher density residential and commercial buildings were constructed. This next view shows structures that were commonplace in the mid to late 19th century. First, we see the City of Sydney extending in the background, with Hyde Park leading toward the spire of St James Church. In the foreground, you can see a house and outbuildings on the corner of Forbes Street, which still stands today at 260 Liverpool Street. The assessment book entries tell me the house was here from at least 1855, and the outbuilding was a stable and coach house. It's unusual that the house survives today, but even more extraordinary that the exterior brickwork of the stable and coach house is still standing. And I would say it's probably the only coach house or stable that's still in existence. And it survived the frenzy of flat and commercial development, which occurred here between the 1910s and the 1930s.
Actually renovated now.
Incorporate, yeah. really, really interesting. So the 1851 assessment book recorded a total of 16 structures on Liverpool Street in Darlinghurst. By 1858, that number was 95 and included 77 houses, 14 shops, 3 hotels, and a wooden store. It was during the 1860s and 1870s that the development of the street entered a boom period. By 1877, the number of houses had more than doubled to 181, and hotels numbered 7. This brings me to another feature of the assessment books, which serve as a relatively reliable geographical marker for the researcher, the hotel. There are a few reasons why hotels are a fantastic wayfinding device for accuracy when it comes to interpreting the assessment books. The first reason is that they were almost always constructed on street corners. I like to view them as geographical bookends to a street section. And when researching the structures in between, they can help with accuracy and consistency in your research. The second reason is that due to their reliable position on the street, they can help the researcher in uncertain years when there were changes in street numbering, as Janet spoke about. The third important detail is that they were often steadfast structures of any street. Once they were built, they were often there to stay throughout the years, even with name changes. Let me give you an example. The building at the juncture of Liverpool and Oxford Streets has functioned as a pub or hotel since 1847, when it was first established as the Terrace Inn and then the Blind Beggar Inn. We know it today as the Burdekin Hotel, and for many years the property was owned by the prominent merchant family, the Burdekins. Since 1847, the hotel has undergone 4 transformations, thanks to the additional research by Layla, not 3, as I'd previously thought, 4. It started out life as a 2-story public house, typical of the mid-19th century in terms of its design. It then morphed into an ornate 3-story brick hotel, featuring an imposing decorative tower. It was completed in 1901 and known as Andy Flanagan's Hotel, after its publican, Andrew Dooley Flanagan, whose run of the hotel spanned 25 years. This version was short-lived, as it made way for the Sydney Municipal Council plans to widen Oxford Street. The designs for the new Flanagan's Hotel buildings survive in the city's archives and were prepared by the City Architect's Office. They show a more ambitious scheme devised by architect James Henry Merriman, featuring a 4-story stone and brick building, again with a tower. It was completed in 1911. Its final iteration is what we see today, an Art Deco style hotel constructed for the Brewers, Tooth and Company in 1939. The hotel is a great expression of the urban transformation which was taking place along the street, in the suburb and across the city. It shows the changing requirements and habits of the city's population and the way architecture shifted with these times. But it also jumps beyond the pages of the assessment books and offers the researcher a boon of surprises and twists and turns. For instance, in 1889, a giant brick structure with a galvanised iron roof and styled to emulate the Imperial Palace of Japan was constructed in the block bound by Liverpool, Burton, Thompson and Forbes Streets. A reported 2,000 people attended the opening night of the Darlinghurst skating rink in May 1889. It apparently took 300 men to construct the building in 10 weeks. The entire rink was illuminated by electric and gas lights, overhanging timber floors of American pine. As patrons glided and probably stumbled across the room, they saw themselves reflected in large mirrors placed on the walls, while a bandstand performed suspended mid-air from the ceiling in a circular cage. In October, the venue hosted a baby show with a first prize of £100 and special prizes of £25 for twins and £50 for triplets. Daily attendance numbers were reportedly 12,000 to 15,000 people. with 400 babies exhibited over the 4-day show. Yet despite the rink's apparent popularity and, shall we say, variety of events, it was closed in September 1890. The building was very quickly converted into the Australian Athletic Club, which promoted, and this is a quote, athletic and manly sport. A running track was installed around the entire hall interior, and the seating in the auditorium could accommodate approximately 6,000 people. The main draw card of the club were its boxing classes and matches, led by the notorious Larry Foley, who occupied the post of Director of Gymnasium. On the opening night in 1890, between 3,000 and 4,000 people attended. The audience was treated to a trapeze act from the St. Clair brothers, and one of Foley's apprentices, Albert Griffiths, aka Young Griffo, entered the ring, a man who only a month prior became the first Australian-born world boxing champion. The club met its end in 1893, ironically after a fight between Griffo and an African-American boxer, Jerry Marshall, descended into violent chaos. After functioning as a wool store, the hall was demolished in 1899 to make way for housing. 44 houses to be exact. I wanted to finish by coming back to Slessor's image of a metropolis in the sky. One of my favourite elements of this project was presenting the data from the assessment books in the form of simple charts. The first chart in this walkthrough video shows all the different structure types present on the street between 1851 and 1948. With houses shaded pink filtered out of the table, you can see shops shaded light blue dominated the street. But from 1914, the first flats shaded light green appeared on the street. These first flats were in a 3-storey building which was constructed in 1880 and previously operated as Booth's Hydropathic Baths. The bathhouse was run by Mr. and Mrs. John Booth until 1896. It had a large steam boiler which pumped hot water into all parts of the establishment, and each room featured an improved Turkish bath, which consisted of and this is a description from the newspapers, a high cedar box into which the patient walked. The door was then closed and the lid shut down, with the patient's head protruding through a hole. They claimed to treat everything from liver disease and rheumatism to heart palpitations and indigestion. In 1914, it was converted into a flat building and contained 17 rooms. The word flats can be misleading, as these establishments essentially functioned as boarding houses with common kitchens and bathrooms. The building was demolished in 1917. The assessment books show us that there were significant societal shifts occurring in this part of Sydney from the late 1910s to the 1930s. It changed the way people lived in and perceived the city. Although some Sydney-siders pursued the dream of fresh air and space in the suburbs, others were attracted to the lure of the big city on the harbour. As author Delia Falconer eloquently puts it, apartment living offered easy access to work and the intellectual life of the city. And what better place to experience the big city and modern apartment living than in Darlinghurst, with its mad stone mountains which climbed into the sky. I just want to finish by showing a quick demo of the map and timeline feature on the homepage of darlostories.au. Each of the places I've spoken about today and more are featured here, and it also shows 3 sets of survey plans available in the City of Sydney archives, which date to 1865, 1888 and the 1930s. So I encourage you to visit darlostories.au and discover more about this fascinating area and its history. So thank you.